Okay, picture this. A guy rolls into the royal palace, no appointment, no security clearance, no LinkedIn profile, and just announces to the most powerful, most psychotic king in Israel's history, "Hey, so it's not gonna rain for a few years. Bye," and then vanishes into the desert like he just dropped the mic on the entire weather system. That, my friends, is how you get introduced to Elijah the Tishbite, a man who showed up in scripture with zero backstory, no childhood flashback, no humble beginnings montage. He just appears out of nowhere like a divine plot twist wearing a hairy coat and a leather belt, because apparently that was the prophet's starter pack back then. The king he's talking to is Ahab, a man who married Jezebel, a woman so committed to villain energy that she basically turned worshipping Baal into a full government program, complete with 450 prophets on the royal payroll. Meanwhile, Elijah's out here, like a one-man startup, running entirely on faith and stubbornness. So after he drops the no-rain bombshell, God tells him to go hide by a brook and basically orders room service from the sky. Ravens, actual ravens, fly in twice a day bringing him bread and meat, like some kind of feathered Uber Eats, except the tip is zero and the reviews are non-existent. When the brook dries up because, shocker, there's a drought, God sends him to a poor widow in Zarephath who's literally preparing her last meal before she and her sons starve to death. Elijah strolls up like, "Make me a little cake first," which sounds like the most audacious request in human history, but he promises her flour and oil won't run out. Somehow this becomes the original trust the process story, because that jar of flour just keeps refilling itself for months, like a magic Tupperware container that never needs restocking. Just when things are looking up, the widow's son dies, and she's furious at Elijah like he personally cursed her household. So he carries the kid upstairs, stretches out on him 3 times like he's doing prophet CPR, and the boy comes back to life. That's not even the wildest flex this man pulls off, because 3 years into the drought, God says, "All right, showtime, go back to Ahab." Elijah strolls back into the danger zone, like he didn't just spend years being public enemy number 1, and he sets up what might be the greatest reality TV showdown never filmed. 450 prophets of Baal versus one guy. On Mount Carmel, 2 altars, 2 bulls, and the challenge is simple. Whichever God sends down fire to burn the sacrifice wins. Elijah even gives the other team the home field advantage by letting them go first. So Baal's prophets start dancing, shouting, cutting themselves with swords, working themselves into an absolute frenzy for hours, and nothing happens. Dead silence, not even a spark. Elijah, because he's apparently allergic to being humble, starts trash-talking them, telling them maybe their God is busy, maybe he's on a trip, maybe he's asleep and needs a wake-up call, which is biblical sarcasm at its finest, and honestly deserves its own comedy special. Then, when it's finally his turn, Elijah doesn't just build an altar. He drenches it in water 3 times until the whole thing is basically swimming pool levels of soaked, because apparently winning wasn't enough. He wanted to win in the most dramatic way physically possible. Then he prays one simple prayer, and fire falls from heaven so intense it burns the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and licks up all the water in the trench like it's auditioning for the most extra special effects scene in ancient history. The people fall on their faces, shouting that the Lord is God, and then Elijah, riding the high of the most legendary mic drop in prophetic history, has all 450 false prophets taken down to the valley and executed. You'd think after a win like that, the man would be unstoppable, untouchable, basically the prophet equivalent of a superhero with plot armor. But here's the plot twist nobody saw coming. Jezebel hears what happened and sends a message, basically saying, "You're dead by tomorrow." And Elijah, the same guy who just stared down 450 pagan prophets without flinching, takes one look at that message and full-on sprints into the wilderness like his sandals are on fire, which honestly is one of the most relatable moments in the entire Bible, because nothing breaks you like an angry woman with resources. He ends up under a tree, begging God to just let him die, because he's exhausted, burned out, and convinced he's the only faithful person left on planet Earth. Instead of a lecture, God sends an angel who basically tells him to eat something and take a nap, twice, because sometimes the answer to a spiritual crisis is literally food and sleep, which is honestly the most underrated theology lesson in the whole book. After this divine nap intervention, Elijah travels 40 days to Mount Horeb, where he hides in a cave, waiting for God to show up, and there's wind strong enough to shatter rocks, then an earthquake, then fire, and God is in none of them. Then comes this quiet whisper, and that's where God actually speaks, which is wild because Elijah expected fireworks again, but instead gets stillness. God gently asks him what he's doing there, and Elijah pours out this whole pity party about being alone and hunted, and God basically tells him, "You're not alone. Here's your next assignment," sending him to anoint new kings and recruit his own successor, a farmer named Elisha, who's out plowing with 12 yoke of oxen when Elijah walks up and just throws his cloak on him. No explanation, no formal interview process, just straight up, "You're hired" energy. Elisha immediately understands the assignment, burns his farming equipment, says goodbye to his family, and starts following Elijah like an apprentice, signing up for the most intense internship in history. From here, the story keeps escalating, because Elijah confronts Ahab again after the king straight up murders a guy named Naboth just to steal his vineyard, and Elijah shows up like a divine subpoena, delivering the harshest judgment speech imaginable, predicting disaster for Ahab's entire bloodline. Later, he even calls down fire from heaven, not once but twice, on soldiers sent to arrest him by King Ahaziah, proving that messing with this man is basically requesting your own cremation. Through all of this, Elijah is building toward what might be the most cinematic exit in the entire Old Testament, because instead of dying like a normal human being, Elijah and Elisha are walking together, and Elisha refuses to leave his mentor's side, no matter how many times Elijah tells him to stay behind. They cross the Jordan River, after Elijah parts it with his cloak, like he's auditioning for a sequel to a much more famous water parting story. Elijah asks Elisha what he wants before he goes, and Elisha asks for a double portion of his spirit, which is basically asking to out-level your teacher. Elijah says that's a tough one, but if Elisha sees him leave, it'll happen. Then suddenly a chariot of fire and horses of fire appear, and Elijah gets swept up into heaven in a literal whirlwind. No funeral, no burial, no goodbye speech, just straight up the most epic exit scene ever written, skipping death entirely and ascending while his protege watches in shock, tearing his own clothes in grief and excitement at the same time. Elisha picks up the cloak that falls behind, strikes the Jordan River just like his mentor did, and the waters part again, proving the torch has officially been passed. That's the wild, emotional, occasionally hilarious, deeply human story of Elijah. A man who called down fire from the sky one moment and then ran from a woman's threat the next, who fed a widow with magic flour, and then begged God to let him die under a tree, who out-talked 450 false prophets, but needed an angel to remind him to eat lunch. Honestly, if that's not the most relatable superhero arc in Scripture, I don't know what is, because Elijah teaches us that even the boldest, most powerful people of faith have moments of total burnout, and that God doesn't always show up in the dramatic fire or the earthquake, but sometimes in a whisper, a nap, and a sandwich, and that legacy isn't about how you die, but about who you leave behind to carry the fire forward, literally in this case. That's the complete, wild, unforgettable story of the prophet Elijah,